the New America Foundation, and welcome to what promises to be an interesting, provocative discussion about the Green Bank. We're very pleased to have with us two of the champions of the Green Bank, an innovative institution to finance energy efficiency and conservation in the United States. Representative Chris Van Hollen is busy on Capitol Hill doing the people's business. He will arrive here shortly, and when he does, because his time is limited, we'll transition to his remarks, and maybe there'll be a little time for questions. So he is on his way. In addition, we have Reed Hundt, co-chairman of the Green Bank and former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Many of you may know him as an author of the books In China's Shadow, The Crisis of American Entrepreneurship, and You Say You Want a Revolution, A Story of Information Age Politics. Mr. Hunt is an advisor to McKinsey & Company and the Blackstone Group and a board member of the Intel Corporation. A man of many hats, and the hat he's wearing today is the green hat of co-chairman of the Green Bank. Reed Hunt.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much. And very nice of all of you to come today. Really appreciate the chance to talk to you. I always do need a new introduction, and I appreciate that one. The Coalition for the Green Bank is a voluntary group of businesses, more than 50 businesses. It comes out of a topic that I got very interested in the course of the transition when I was on the transition team, and a group of about 15 of us began to look as deeply as we knew how into the problem of financing the conversion from carbon to clean energy. Of the 15, approximately 14 went into the government, leaving me. And then I just sort of kept on going, and a lot of the businesses that we'd reached out to in the course of the transition said, we'd really like to keep talking about this, and we'd particularly like to be part of the energy legislation in the Senate and the House. I want to introduce and ask that they stand up and say hello, the two key staff people who actually are responsible for the writing of the legislation in a bunch of ways, but in particular in the way that has given legislative reality to the Green Bank. This is Michael Carr on the Senate side from Senator Bingaman's office, and this is Bill Parsons right here from Congressman Van Hollen's office. Later, they will debate the differences between their two versions. You may have to stay very late. I told them I'd buy them lots of beers to get them to really debate the differences. But I think a really quick reading will tell everybody here that the differences are not pretty great, not pretty large, that the similarities of the approach are what's really, really important. And these two provisions, one on the Senate side, one on the House side, if they become law, and we surely hope that they do, they represent the first long-term significant commitment by the United States to use low-cost financing to provide the major part or a major part of our electricity grid. Now, low-cost financing sponsored by the government has been the tool used for the creation of electricity in every country in the world except the United States. And it has been used since electricity was commercially invented. My career seems to be all about electromagnetic waves. First, those that we use for communications, and now those that we use for electricity. And what is remarkable about both these stories, the communications revolution of the 90s and on up to the present, and the coming revolution as we move to clean electricity. What's remarkable about both of them is that the price tag over a 20-year period is about the same. Each one of them requires about $1 trillion of new investment. And the second thing is that each one requires the overbuilding of an old technology, an old platform, an old network with something new. The new thing in communications we all experience every day. It is mobile communications, and it is data. It used to be fixed line and just voice. And the move to mobile and to data cost about $1 trillion in CapEx. That's what has been spent from the early 90s to the present. And I'm not saying that work is done, but it is almost completely finished, meaning we see almost everywhere in the country widespread, abundant, affordable, and very, very, very cheap access to bits. So the goal for any country's national economic policy is to have abundant, widespread, and low-priced inputs to the economy, and the two key inputs are communication services and electricity. There's not a country in the world that wants electricity to be really, really high-priced. If electricity is really high-priced, it is a way to hamper your economic development. It is a way to reduce the quality of living. We do not want a world where information is just print on paper, and we don't want a world that is lit only by fire. We all want a world in which communication services are available very cheaply to everyone, and in which clean electricity is available very cheaply to everyone. So the idea behind what our coalition called the Green Bank, and both houses of Congress are now calling CEDA, Clean Energy Deployment Administration. The goal is the one that I've just stated, which is very abundant, very widespread, low-priced electricity. So what I'm going to show you in these slides is just two things. First, this. This is a slide that shows the economics of a wind project, clean energy project. Very simplistic, very straightforward, and here's the answer. When you have your debt borrowed in the market without the government guaranteeing it, in a normal market, it's 8.5%. We're not in a normal market. Now you can't get it at all, or if you can get it, it's 10% or 12%. But in a normal market, 8.5% is a reasonable number. And when you put this much money into the project and you borrow, let's say, half the money at 8.5%, the result on average is that you have to increase the price to the consumer. This increase here is about a 10% increase in the average price. About a 10% increase in the average price. But it's not necessary. It's not required. It's not mandatory. It isn't pain that we all have to suffer. We don't need to say, let's hurt the consumer to help the consumer. It doesn't make sense. It isn't required. And with CEDA, the way that it's written in these both houses of Congress, is that if you take the cost of debt down to 4.5%, you don't have to raise the price to the consumer. Because in any business, if you lower this cost, you don't have to charge the consumer that much money. And so it's a very, very simple concept. This, by the way, is the way China is financing its move to clean energy. We're rightly concerned about the fact that China is one of the biggest burners of coal in the world, but we also need to pay attention here in the United States to the fact that China is using financing mechanisms to become the biggest wind producer and the biggest solar producer and the biggest manufacturer of the piece parts that make wind and solar farms of any country in the world. And so in the energy bill that Senator Bingaman passed out of his committee and that the whole House voted at the end of June, in both those bills there's a recognition that the United States does not need to and cannot take the risk of giving up leadership in energy technologies. Does not need to punish its consumers and isn't going to punish its consumers, but is going to protect its consumers, and cannot sit aside idly as the energy sector lacks investment, doesn't engage in new projects, but instead we need the government to step in to help the private sector find a way to fund these projects. It's a extremely simple concept. There's a lot of complexity, but one of the beautiful parts about both the House and the Senate approach from the perspective of the business members of our coalition is that the industries, the private sector, will be selecting the projects and investing its own money in these projects and putting its own money at risk. And this is a critical feature of capitalism that we want to embrace. I love the way the Chinese are doing the financing, but the other part of it is that Beijing picks all the projects. Well, we don't have a centralized government of that sort, fortunately. In fact, we have, in electricity, government intervention primarily at the state level. So what this chart shows you is if you look at the states of the United States, you see that retail electricity prices vary quite significantly across the states. We picked here, and this is done by Sarah Davidson and Alex Craigie. I don't know where Alex is, but they're right here, the two staffers to our coalition. We have picked 5 categories of prices, which are over here. And the light blue and the dark blue are the below average prices, and the pink and the red are the above average prices. Now, of all the identical products in our economy, all the products that are the same everywhere you buy them, milk, gasoline, electricity, of all the products, the one that varies the most state by state is electricity. And these variations are quite significant. And as you can see, the variations are clustered around certain regions. And then you ask, well, how can electricity vary that much state by state? And the answers are the following. First, electricity, unlike anything else you can think of, cannot be stored. Since it cannot be stored, it cannot be easily shipped. It, in fact, is expensive to ship electricity. That's what a transmission line is all about, and a transmission line is a very expensive form of shipment. So it can't be stored, it can't be shipped without great cost, and so consequently the microeconomics of electricity generation always come from one particular local area. And it won't surprise you if I tell you that West Virginia, right here on the map, has the lowest electricity prices in the country. Now, people have been leaving West Virginia as opposed to going in. There's no great new demand for electricity from businesses, and the available natural resource that is the cheapest to get in West Virginia, of course, is coal. So the people in West Virginia pay a very low price for electricity, and it is a coal-based electricity generation plant, and that is a story about electricity that is completely different from the story in the state of Washington, where it is hydroelectric power that is primarily used, and a pretty low price comes out of that too. And that's completely different from Connecticut, which lacks both the hydro and the coal and pays almost 3 times the price that is paid in West Virginia for electricity. The point is that in both these bills, the bank, or CEDA, was empowered to loan on different bases and in different ways state by state, so as to adjust for the microeconomics of each particular state and to protect the consumers in each particular state and to have real projects take place in every particular state. So when you look at the House bill and you look at what Senator Bingman passed out of his committee, there's no sense that it's one size fits all, or that we're going to have just one form of electricity generation from coast to coast, or that everyone is going to be treated as if they were an average. That's not the nature of the business, and that's not the way the legislation was written. The legislation, in fact, has been written to reflect the needed accommodations to protect consumers and protect the economies on a state-by-state basis, and in some states on a locality-by-locality basis. This is actually very wise legislation. The only thing that I could possibly say that was a fault, although it's a necessary fault, of the House bill is that it's long. And as a result of the fact that it's long, the news about what it really does, to be honest, it hasn't yet gotten out into the public domain. I have not even seen as yet a complete summary of the House bill. This is because there were a lot of individualized issues, and there was a lot of attempt made, I think quite rightly, to cope with these individual issues. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful to you, Michael, and to New America for hosting this is that we all need a collective effort to look into the overall impact of the bill, recognizing that in many ways that impact should and does vary locality by locality. Because I believe that when we summarize these local impacts and form an aggregate view of the effect of the House bill and its Senate counterparts, here's what we're going to discover. We're going to discover that electricity prices don't go up or don't need to go up anywhere in the country. We're going to discover that every time an American household flips on a switch, they're going to be saving money. That's going to come from the efficiency measures and the bank financing. We're going to also discover that if the bank is fully funded and if the legislation is completed in the form that we now see it, we're going to end up with between 1 and 2 million permanent new jobs added to the workforce. Just pause for a second. That's exactly what happened when we overbuilt the communications network with mobile networks and with data networks. Millions of new jobs were created in the workforce, and they're still around. Not jobs that are stimulated for a short period of time to deal with a downturn, although there's not one thing wrong with that. Not that, but a permanent addition to the workforce where people engage in construction projects that last in the aggregate, not any one project, but in the aggregate 5 years, 10 years, 15 and 20 years. And then there's still jobs afterwards in the maintenance of all of these new facilities. That's what it means in Schumpeterian language to talk about creative destruction. And the creativity here is the replacement of clean in the place of dirty as a source of energy. And the changeover, this grand changeover, is going to be so great for our economy, not just because of the economic growth, and not just because we're going to be able to keep prices down and keep them continually going down, but also one more thing that just has to be added. A completely clean electric grid, coast to coast, is the platform for electric transportation. And when we have that platform in existence, we are not going to be, as an economy, subject to the oscillations and vicissitudes of international commodity prices, or to put it more bluntly, we will not be any longer at the end of the whip held by other countries. And we will not any longer have to wake up and say, wait a minute, oil prices are spiking once again. What will be the impact on our economy? That's the real point of energy independence, not just to, although it's not a small thing, not just to free us up in terms of foreign relations, but more fundamentally to permit us to have a reliable, assured, abundant, long-term, low-priced source of energy. We would not want our internet prices to be set in some other country. We don't want our energy prices to be set in some other country. So these two goals, low-priced, abundant communications and low-priced, abundant, clean electricity, are the goals that were set in the first case by the 1996 Telecom Act and in the second case by this energy legislation, which I can just tell you all the 50 businesses in our coalition are really eager to see these bills become law in the country. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. The congressman's on his way.
Okay.
But if you'd like to make a few more points, or we could take a question.
Want to take some questions?
Sure.
And you know, everyone should feel free to put Bill Parsons or Michael Carr on the spot too, because we're very lucky to have the people who are here actually in doing the people's business. Just tell us who you are when you launch your question, so everyone else can get the name too, sir.
My name's Henry Cole, Henry S. Cole and Associates Environmental. Much of what I do is consult with communities on environmental issues. And I'm wondering if there's a way to build local governments and local communities into this coalition to get their support, because surely you're going to get a lot of opposition from those who say, well, you're picking winners and you're going to add to the deficit and you're interfering with the economy, on and on and on. But that might be to include localities and specific communities to strengthen those economies which are very badly hurt. Might be a way to broaden the support.
Well, I can only say this about the coalition. Anyone can join, and no one has to pay, and our meetings end on time. So anyone would be welcome. Let me cut off the questions because I really would like to introduce our congressman and the author of the Green Bank Act in the House, Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you, Rick. How are you? Nice to see you.
Chris doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give him a slight one. In the year 2001, I think it was you decided to run for Congress. Early 2001, do I remember right?
Exactly.
He decided to run for Congress in Montgomery County against an 8-term congressman, Connie Morella, one of the most popular people in the history of Maryland politics. And Chris built, in some kind of presaging of the Barack Obama campaign, he built a true, deep grassroots campaign that carried him to victory. It was a very bold thing to do. It was a very politically risky thing to do. I was very proud to see him do it, and enough of us felt that way to deliver the victory. But I have to tell you, as a constituent and as a citizen, Chris has just been a hero to all of us, and in his now 4 terms in Congress, he has proved to be a leader for the whole country. Chris decided that he wanted to get involved in this topic. He took leadership. He and a number of other congressmen, Mr. Inslee, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Waxman, Mr. Markey, Mr. Rangel, but a pretty small group, really dug into this topic. And I think you've got someone here that everyone in America can be proud of, and also you'll be able to ask him a few questions about what's really going to happen. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Reed, for that generous introduction. It's always good to have one of your constituents who needs your help filling the potholes in front of their house to introduce you. So thank you for that very generous and warm introduction. I do have to say to Reed Hunt, I want to also thank him for his tremendous efforts on behalf of this initiative and the Green Bank initiative. Also want to introduce Bill Parsons with my team. He's the legislative director, has done a lot of work on this. Michael Lynn, thank you, and the New America Foundation for hosting us today. And I'm not sure that, Reed, you've gone through a number of your slides talking about the virtues of the Green Bank, but let me just give you a little bit of an update on where I think we are politically in terms of the energy bill, but also where this piece fits in. And this is a group that's obviously been engaged in energy policy issues for a long time. So I'm not going to start at why we need to move forward in this area with the new energy policy. But I do believe that the House passed bill, contained a number of key elements within its architecture. One was, of course, the renewable electricity, new renewable energy portfolio standard that combined a standard for both energy, clean energy as well as energy efficiency savings in that, which helps provide a guaranteed market in some sense for the generation of clean energy and also provides clear incentives for energy efficiency savings. Obviously, the cap and trade structure creates incentives for the production and generation of less carbon-intense energy, and does that essentially by raising the price and costs of the most polluting, the most carbon-intensive sources of energy. So that's the approach, of course, the cap and trade position takes by, it essentially advantages cleaner renewable energies by making carbon-based fuels more expensive. But if we want to make all this work and protect the consumer at the same time, it's our view that you have to also accelerate the deployment of clean energy technologies and energy efficiencies because we do not want consumers to face sticker shock as a result of this piece of legislation. We want to make sure that we accelerate the deployment of cleaner energies and make them available in a way that consumers can afford. And that is one of the key virtues of this Green Bank proposal, which is that by providing lower cost financing, and this is not supposed to be a substitute for the regular capital markets, but because we have established moving forward in clean energy as a national priority for national security reasons, as well as climate change reasons, and because we don't want to be beaten by our competitors on the jobs front, we did think it was worth setting up at the federal level an entity whose mission it would be to provide some lower cost capital, especially at a point in time where credit markets are still very tight, so that we could accelerate the deployment of these energy technologies. And we believe by creating an entity whose sole mission is to do that and who will have representation from different federal agencies that have a stake in that and will be essentially peopled by people who are experts in finance and energy, that we can accelerate the deployment of those technologies more rapidly, get them into the consumer benefits more quickly, and therefore help protect consumers as we go through this transition. So we're really pleased that we were able to get it through the House because of the House rules, and we had to make sure that there was an offset, a pay-for, and we were able to allocate some of the allowances under the energy bill toward meeting that requirement. And we capitalized this bank by floating bonds, treasury bonds, we call them green bonds, which will generate about $7.5 billion for the initial capitalization of the bank. Capital inflows can, of course, increase over time, but the whole idea is that this bank will be self-sustaining. It will invest in clean energy projects that get a return for the bank, and that way they leverage private sector dollars with that initial public capitalization. And again, the idea is that they identify projects that, for whatever reason, can't find adequate credit in the regular markets today or down the road, but make these decisions in a way that assures a return to the bank so that we don't have to continue to support and subsidize the bank beyond the capital that we put in initially. The bill is obviously over in the Senate now. The Senate's moving forward. A number of committees are moving forward. Senator Bingaman's been very interested and involved in approaching in a similar approach to these questions, and we look forward to working with them on the details of this legislation and making sure that we reach our mutual and common purpose in providing this kind of a financing alternative. We believe that by having an entity whose exclusive mission is financing these projects, we can best accelerate the deployment of these technologies. So we'll have to see where the Senate takes us. I know the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, has recently indicated his interest in moving some kind of energy legislation to the floor of the Senate, possibly in September after the August break. And we're very hopeful that he will keep to that schedule, and we'll have to see what comes out of the different Senate committees. As you know, just as in the House, there were a number of committees involved. There are in the Senate as well, and we'll have to see what emerges between Senator Bingaman, Senator Boxer, and others who are very involved in this issue in the Senate side. But we are hopeful that the country is, I believe, not just poised and ready, but wants us to embark on a new energy strategy. I think that was very much part of the conversation during the last presidential campaign. It was certainly part of the conversations that took place in a lot of the congressional races around the country. And while we can disagree with some of the details, and while the bill that passed the House, I'd be the first to say, is imperfect, it's not everything that all of us would have wanted. In fact, in some ways, it's got things in it that we would not have wanted, each of us. The fact of the matter is, if you were to ask people, I think even a year ago, what the prospects were of the House passing a major piece of energy legislation like that on this timetable, they would have said, you're crazy, it can't happen. So we've made enormous progress. We still have a long way to go, but with your help, we will get there. So thank you for the opportunity and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions. It is always perilous to leave the Hill in the middle of the day, and I'm going to have to run in a minute, but I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you've got.
Questions for the comments? Up here in the front.
Yes, Alfred Meyer. I'm a citizens here in Washington. I share your concern for the climate change, and I really appreciate the effort you've made to address it. My question is really, is this a new policy? As I understand the bill, it could include 30% for nuclear, which is an old technology which has terrific problems even in its new incarnation, and 30% for so-called clean coal. And that's really a pie-in-the-sky thing to be developed. So is the majority of this money really going to new and clean resources?
Well, the limitation in the bill, and the question of dealing with clean coal technologies and nuclear power were issues that obviously came up throughout the conversation on the overall bill, the big bill. And as you know, in order to get the support to get the bill passed, a lot of allowances, for example, were allocated toward clean coal technology research and other efforts to reduce the impact on, at least over a period of time, they phase out over a period of time, on energy generated from coal or carbon-intensive sources. With respect to nuclear, the very fact that it's a cap and trade bill will clearly advantage those sources of energy that are not carbon producing. And so in that sense, the overall architecture of the bill does provide some advantages to nuclear power vis-a-vis carbon-intensive power, but not vis-a-vis other clean technologies. With respect to the Green Bank, the limitation, there's no guaranteed set-aside for any sector. What it says is that no one sector can receive more than 30% of the benefit. So, for example, solar projects and investments could not receive more than 30% of the total. But there's no guarantee that any sector get at least 30%. And that was the result, frankly, of compromise. It was not a provision that was in the original bill that we had, but you could actually see it playing both ways. I mean, there were some people who were concerned that if you allowed nuclear, it could consume more than 30%. There were some that were concerned that it would somehow be written out of the bill entirely. The original version of the bill said that with respect to nuclear power, they had to exhaust their existing loan guarantees that are already out there before they could come to the Green Bank. So this was the result of a compromise. This piece of it was built off of something that came out of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Thank you, Representative Van Holt.
Thank you. I apologize for having to run, but after we thanks. After we did energy, we are now debating, as many of you know, healthcare reform. So it's a very busy and active time on Capitol Hill. It's an exciting time. But we welcome your continued input on this and the other issues that are out there. And I know there are probably some constituents here. I just want to say it's a privilege to represent all of you in the from the 8th Congressional District. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Van Hollen. I'd like to ask Michael Carr, who is counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and who has been one of the principal architects of the legislation on the Senate side, working along with Senator Bingaman, just to give us his thoughts on the topic and on the prospects for the fate of the Senate side. Mike Carr?
Thanks. I wasn't really expecting to talk, so but I did want to just kind of give you a bit of an update on sort of where we are in the Senate. We have passed out of the Energy Committee our package, which includes as Title I CEDA. The report is currently being finalized and will be filed soon, so it's, from our perspective, ready for floor action. The provisions on CEDA are, I think, as Reed alluded to, 95% identical to the House provisions. There's a few relatively minor differences in sort of in approach, and I think we'll probably just work those out as we go forward. What our expectation is that when the majority leader finds time to schedule the debate on the Senate floor, which we anticipate to be end of September, October timeframe. Our title will be one of several from the relevant committees that'll be stitched together on the floor, including the stuff that comes out of EPW on cap and trade. Probably agriculture will probably produce a section. Finance will almost invariably produce a tax title. So then we'll work our way through it. frankly, in similar fashion to the way we have with energy bills in the past. It's the way the 2005 and 2007 energy bills worked as well. In 2007, we had the CAFE title that was stitched on to an energy package from the Commerce Committee. So I think that's the way it looks going forward. We've spent a lot of time, and appreciate the good efforts of the Green Bank Coalition, bringing a lot of people together to talk about what the opportunities are in this sector, and certainly my boss has gotten very excited about what we might be able to achieve, and we've to sort of demonstrate his level of commitment. In the Senate version, we have $10 billion in direct spending as the initial funding for the CEDA, including one difference that I think I'll just point out is that in the Senate version, we envision CEDA as a successor program to the current Title 17 loan guarantee program, which has I think about $6.5 or so billion available to it right now for loan guarantees. What we would expect is what remains of that at the time that CEDA is set up would pour over into that fund. So we view the minimum amount that would be available for CEDA in our package at $10 billion, and it could be as much as 16.5 or so. So that's sort of our current status. I don't want to. There's no, you've sort of got the backstory, but I'm happy to answer any questions along with Reed.
Have a question?
Kill that projector.
Hello, my name is John Tucker. I'm an analyst with the National Academy of Public Administration. My question has to do with the provisions, well, 3 of the deployment goals in the House Act talk about building manufacturing or production capacity, both for the technologies themselves and materials. And I was just wondering what the thinking is in terms of how the bank would approach that, and in partnership with what other agencies. I mean, that's a rather more tricky issue than deploying the technology, which could be made anywhere.
Why don't I take that? You asked about the House bill. Let me just answer by way of sharing a conversation with one of the congressmen who ended up voting yes. He said, I'd like to know if the bank would be there to provide some debt financing that would support equity investors in my district's main town. And I said, what kind of manufacturing are you talking about? And he said, it's very low tech, that we want them to make wind turbines, basically windmills. It's not a particularly adventurous technology, but you need to raise capital, and you need to know when you're doing this that you'll have some facility that you'll be able to sell the fans to. And the answer is yes, that's the kind of thing that the bank under the House bill would be able to do. Just to remind, it's a nonprofit bank. So in that particular project, presumably what would happen is an equity investor would join with a local bank, and they would say, here's the project, but we would like the Green Bank, or CEDA, we would like that bank to guarantee the debt. And that'll make it financially attractive for the local retail bank and the local investors to put the project together. So that's the concept at the micro level, but it's primarily at the micro level that this would work, meaning we're not talking now about high-risk, high-tech projects. There are plenty of such efforts, and those are good things, and they are supported by a variety of features in the House bill, and the Senate has similar approaches. But by and large, what we're talking about here is building the capability through, among other things, a low-cost government-supported financing to create the whole value chain, where The products and materials would be built that would go into the wind farms and into the solar farms, and where, when this was fully deployed, we would be able to look forward to about 20 gigawatts of clean energy being added to our capability per year for 20 years. 20 times 20 is 400. If you add that much clean energy to our electric generation capability over about a 20-year period, coupled with other advances and measures that come out of both our innovation economy and the law, we could expect at the end of that 20 years that substantially more than half of all the electricity in the United States came from a non-carbon footprint.
That's counting nuclear, which is about
Counting nuclear. Right.
Just to get in just a little bit more into the weeds, just the goals are identical in the House and Senate as far as I'm aware. There's two actual primary mechanisms in the bill, and one is direct financing, and the other is indirect. And just to kind of give you a sense of the difference, the direct financing is essentially what we're doing with the auto loan, for the retooling and the manufacturing of efficient automobiles. That was a provision that we put in the 2007 bill, Section 136, and it's so we sort of thought of that same kind of thing for manufacturing, for windmills or anything else. So you might have that, and that would depend on the size. But for smaller manufacturing, I think it's much more likely that you're going to have this kind of partnership that Reed was talking about, and that's probably going to be more in the indirect, where essentially the federal government stands in as an underwriter and allows the origination to come from some regional bank. So it could be a loan guarantee, it could be just providing lower cost money to the bank to do the lending in the first place. As long as the screens are applied that are within CEDA, then the flexibility is there to do it any way that needs to be done.
Other questions? Back here?
I'm Carlin Rosengarten with Living Cities. In terms of the Senate bill, what compromises do you expect will occur over the next couple months before it's passed or not passed, before it's voted on, compared, say, with the compromises that were made in the House bill?
I assume you're referring to the broader package and not just this, the energy package. From our perspective, I mean, the energy package, just our piece that we've worked on with CEDA as its centerpiece was a bipartisan package, and so I think we've sort of gotten to a point of equilibrium, at least we feel, on that part that is viable on the floor. As to the larger package, that's very tough for any of us to sort of guess at right now, and that's part of the process. And in the Senate, in contrast to the House, we tend to do a lot of those things on the floor. So what you might see come out of the various committees on the floor, might not reflect where we have to end up at the end of the day. And so we tend to see a lot of those things in the form of amendments from various coalitions. And so I doubt this will be that much different. I could see that kind of a process going forward. Sorry, that's not really it's all unclear right now. But you will see it play out probably right there on the floor. That's the way it tends to work in the Senate.
John Mullen, AMB International Finance. As originally drafted, I believe the Green Bank was to create a new independent entity along the lines of the Export-Import Bank. I take it that that CEDA is now seen as a successor to the existing DOE guarantee program, and therefore will be within the Department of Energy?
That's a distinction between the Senate. That's the way the Senate bill, as you just described it, that's the way the Senate bill is. The House bill is a similar entity, but as an independent entity. They didn't touch the Title 17 program.
John Nelson with Wall Street Without Walls. We're like Doctors Without Borders, except we have investment bankers who volunteer their time to help nonprofits and community groups like yours access the capital markets. We're associated with a bunch of investment bankers who are committed to energy independence for the United States. I think they would very much like to be pro bono advisors to this situation, in particular how to leverage the fund more effectively. I spoke to Reed about this earlier. There are underutilized federal assets that could be used as extra collateral for such a deal like this. There are socially responsible investors that might put certificates of deposit into such a thing for low interest returns. There are socially responsible investors and foundations that would do the same thing with their mission-related investments. So I think you ought to think more creatively about how to leverage the funds. And then finally, the point of there's both a need for rural and urban energy creation. And we're working with some Brooklyn 2,500 unit apartments that want to convert themselves into utilities, actually produce electricity from on the roofs of their buildings and so on. And then the Milken Institute, which we work with also, is very committed to rural electrification, working with the USDA, and I think that those are the two areas you ought to be looking at. And finally, we'll be happy to join the coalition if you'd like to have us join.
So anyone can join, but especially my college classmate, John.
Oh, let me just make one quick point on that. One of our real key issues in crafting the legislation was to try to be as flexible as possible. So there are a range of possible ways to sort of advance the ball on this. The thing that we continue to run up against, just from a drafting standpoint, is the way federal budgeting works is not exactly the way it works in the commercial sector. So some things are of necessity not available to us, but I'd be happy to see if we can make stuff work that you folks have encountered out there in the private sector.
Yeah, I have a sort of a technical question, but it has to do with the financing of it. Simultaneously, while Congress is debating this, creating an entity to engage in low-cost financing, it has also over the past few years passed tax credit bonds. The clean and renewable energy bonds and the qualified energy conservation bonds, which allows state and local governments to issue federally favored debt for most of these same purposes, energy efficiency and conversion and so on. How do you see these two approaches? One is the indirect federal subsidy of the state and local projects, and the low-cost financing by federal energy. Do you see them as being complementary? Or are they in competition? What are the merits and demerits? And particularly, the tax credit bonds are not scored as part of the federal deficit, even though arguably they blow holes in the budget because of their tax expenditures. Mm-hmm. Whereas, as I understand it, the relying on treasury bonds would enlarge the deficit, right? So what's the connection between the tax credit bonds and the Green Bank, if any?
Let me say one thing and then turn most of this over to Michael. The one thing I want to say is, picking up on something Mike said earlier about the difference between budget rules and reality, the taxpayers actually won't lose any money by guaranteeing these loans. There's no intent to have it be an expenditure where the money doesn't come back. Or to phrase it differently, the kinds of projects that you'd want to have the bank guarantee are projects where when we pay for this cheap, abundant, clean electricity, we're also paying off the debt.
Right, but the initial capitalization through the Treasury would increase the debt.
I acknowledge that Congress does not regard money that comes back as money that comes back.
I'm not defending our debt scoring.
The rules say that it's an expenditure. I'm just pointing out that the money comes back and the taxpayer ends up no worse off. In fact, the taxpayer gets the interest on the debt, and eventually the principal is paid off. This is different than virtually all other federal spending where some service is purchased, as in the case of Medicare, for example, but the money never comes back. Now, that's just a brief intervention from the world of reality. But turning to the world of budgeting, well, let me turn it over to Mike.
Right. Well, but what Reed was just talking about is actually a really key point in that, the $10 billion that's set aside in the Senate bill, that goes it's expended on subsidy costs. And subsidy costs are not costs in the sense that anybody in this room would think of a cost. It's a guarantee. And even if you issue that loan and have to set aside a certain amount of money, even if it's paid back 100%, even if it's paid back at a profit, you still lost that money from a budgeting perspective. And so that's, why we needed to make a pool. I very much agree. It doesn't add to the deficit. It's very likely this is, somewhere between neutral and a money maker overall in real terms. But in budget terms, it's going to score. On the sort of the more technical question of how these bonding authorities would interact, we don't intend to supplant things like CREBs, for example. But at the same time, we've gotten a fair amount of complaint that CREBs are not that terribly effective. That people are they're just too hard to access, and it's too hard to pull together, particularly for the smaller projects. So what we envision is that whatever the local mechanism, and it may be a municipal bond, as Berkeley's done with their Berkeley First, or on-bill financing. So maybe there may be some financing arrangement that a utility can arrange. If the federal government can step in as the underwriter, as the backstop, and so just push down on the cost of capital to make that thing work, then frankly we're agnostic as to how they actually do the repayment. We're just gonna make sure that it's a good, solid investment to the government. So if it's a tax advantage bond, if it's a local bond, I don't think we care.
Okay, why don't we take 2 or 3 more questions and wrap it up, and we'll do a round robin.
Thanks. James Berry from Third Way. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Hunt, about drawing a lot of comparisons to the telecom revolution, and I like that comparison a lot, with the exception.
It's the only one I know.
Right, right. But there's one part of it that might not work, and that is the generation and transmission that doesn't exist in the wind heavy areas and the sun rich areas that would need to be created and built in order to actually bring that power to load centers. So does CEDA help finance those large transmission projects and overlays that would?
Yes, it does.
Be required?
Look, indulge me a bit. I just want to say a couple things about this analogy. The analogy to transmission that I think you'd have to find in communications would be long-haul networks. Long-haul networks with optical technology, originally pioneered by MCI, and now the way that you watch YouTube. Meaning you're sitting here and you call it up and you're actually getting that video, those bits, from a data center, which I think is in Walla Walla, Washington, actually. And it's coming to you at virtually no cost, meaning Google's probably losing money on it, but I mean, even for Google, it's extremely low cost. Why is that? Because there is a reasonably newly built, within the last decade, a pattern of long-haul networks that stretches from right here where we are at this exact moment to Walla Walla, and very advanced photonics is the technology on fiber that is giving you access to that. In fact, data centers now consume 2% of all electricity in the United States. Didn't even exist 15 years ago. Now, how did they get built? $100 billion was invested in these long-haul networks within the course of about 10 years. It was not done by government financing. It was done because the market structure was one in which it was possible for new demand to be translated into new purchases. This is where there's a big difference in these two analogies. There was lots of new demand for mobile telephony. Once people found out that they didn't have to sit down at a fixed line at a table to make a phone call, but they could be walking around, they said, this is something new, and I'll frankly pay new money for it. And the same thing with the internet, right? So it's great to have it be that the bits are cheap and abundant, but there's a tremendous amount of new demand that drove this deployment. We don't have huge new demand in electricity. In fact, electricity consumption in this year is less than last year because it tracks the GDP. And when we look out 10 years into the future, the total amount of new demand is very small, very small. So we can't trust new demand to replace the carbon-based electricity system. We have to have some other mechanism to have that great changeover take place. And that's why in the House bill, and the Senate's going to be looking at the exact same thing, there's this thing called RES, or Renewable Electricity Standard, that means everybody just has to buy some of the clean energy, and that means they have to stop using and turn down some of the dirty energy. And the cap is supposed to tell them, pick the dirtiest things first to shut off, and the bank steps in and says, and we'll finance this changeover so that the price doesn't go up, your shareholders won't be hurt, and your consumers won't be hurt. So what I'm trying to say is that the overbuild is analogous, and the piece parts of the network are analogous, but this big missing difference is we have to create some forcing mechanism, because we don't just have new demand. There's no electricity world equivalent of YouTube. And that's why these pieces all get together, and that's why, as Michael said, multiple committees on the Senate side have to stitch pieces together to get an overall bill that the president can sign and vault us into global leadership. And we want to be somewhere in the back in the Rose Garden when that happens. That's our goal.
Yeah, I mean, on the Senate, we had an RES in our package, and that's part of the demand part of the equation. I think, carbon emissions pricing is another part of the demand emissions part of the equation. On a very specific technical level, to answer your question, there's several parts of CEDA. The goal, one of the explicit goals, is increasing transmission capacity for renewables, and also the very definition of clean energy technology. It's a three-part definition. One part is that it transmits energy more efficiently through the infrastructure of the United States. So we were thinking very much about it.
Last question.
Hi, Bill Tucker. Thank you both for coming here and explaining a very complex topic. In regard to the loan guarantees and your statement that this wouldn't cost the taxpayer any money, it will cost if the loans are not paid back, and we know some of them will not be, because there wouldn't be any reason to make the guarantee if they were going to be paid back.
No, the guarantee is to lower the cost of debt, but it is not to take extra risk. This is not about the government absorbing risk. It is just about the government, which is the lowest cost capital provider for everything, because it's got the ability, to convince investors that it's certain that its bonds are good, right? So it's not about taking risk. This is not about taking risk. It is about just plain lowering the cost of capital to lower the price that has to be charged to the end user.
But the loan isn't paid back to government.
That's absolutely right. But the concept, I'll speak for the House side, because that was been more of our experience to date. Michael can speak to the Senate side, but the fundamental concept is we're not talking about high-risk ventures for the most part. We're not talking about that. We're talking about scale. We're talking about having a lot happen every year, year after year, so that we get off of a footprint that is fundamentally carbon-based and get onto a footprint that is clean. And in electricity, while you don't have new demand, here's what you do have: reliable demand. You do have continuous demand. When I say that it's down 3%, it isn't down 10% and it isn't down 20%, right? So you can't count on lots of new demand, but you can count on steady demand. And so the projects that we're talking about would match up against demand. And by the way, every state regulatory commission in the country has done this for decades. They don't permit and authorize projects unless the demand is rock solid in advance. So we're not talking about risking lots of money into ventures that are just plain dicey. What we are talking about is replacing a lot of what is with something new. There's no question that we're talking about that. That's the goal.
let me give a really boring answer to go with that. There is actually the way federal budgeting works is that when you issue a loan guarantee, a loan, anything, they're all the same. You account for the risk on a net present value basis. You take, what's the probability of that loan going bad, and you set aside that piece of money, and you put it into a larger insurance pool. And we do this for loan guarantees across the government in any context. Department of Agriculture issues loan guarantees, Small Business Administration issues loan guarantees. They're all over the place, and they use the same insurance pool. And the CBO and the OMB annually reviews all of our subsidy cost models and tries to make sure that they're as accurate as possible. So if something has, say, a 10% chance of going bad, then you set aside 10% of the money. Now, what CEDA does is it doesn't necessarily have to pay that money itself. It can ask that money from the applicant. And that's the way the current loan guarantee program works almost exclusively. So, again, as Reed was saying, it's really not about taking on risk. It's about deploying the federal balance sheet, which is, the big problem that a lot of these folks face, particularly when you get into startups, is their balance sheet is, $10 million, $100 million. I mean, that's the size of the company. Who is going to give them $1 billion loan for a major wind deployment? It's impossible. The only way you can do it is to have somebody step in with the deep pockets. But you can still ask them for that amount of money. So the government is not at risk in the aggregate. They can, a loan, if that any loan that goes bad is paid for by all the other loans that we guaranteed that didn't go bad, and we have lots and lots of those. The insurance pool on net on a year-to-year basis is cash positive to the federal government. So that's our vision. Now, one addendum to it is we do want to let CEDA push down on some, if there's a real opportunity, a breakthrough opportunity to get to the next level of technology and something really important, then that's what that money is for. That $10 billion is that they can go ahead and they can say, well, we'll pay for that right now, and then they can take profit participation or some kind of a sharing in the upside on the back end to reimburse the federal government for it, that technology paying off. In those kind of technologies, we might take a portfolio approach, and some might go bad. But in the aggregate, their mission is to stay level or make money for the government.
So let me just add one thing, because I always like to have it be real simple in my mind so I can remember it. In venture capital, you expect 1 out of 10 of your projects to succeed. In this area, we expect 1 out of 10 to not work out. The reverse of venture capital.
Well, please join me in thanking Representative Chris Van Hollen, Reed Hunt, and Michael Clark. Thank you very much.
Thanks for doing this. Very well done.